Okay, hello again. Let's continue with the structure of the eyeball. Refractive media should be discussed. It consists of lens anteriorly, as mentioned before, and vitreous body behind of it. The lens separates practically two spaces, the posterior eye chamber into which the aqueous humor is released or produced by the ciliary processes, and only through the pupillary margin of the pupil itself of the iris, this aqueous humor can reach to the anterior eye chamber, which lies between the cornea and the iris and the anterior surface of the lens. So the location, the situation of the lens is behind the iris, kept by the zonular fibers of thin. Histological structure you can see here. The diameter of it, the biggest diameter is 9 mm across, and it has got different layers. Part of the iris is also included in this picture. The most anterior layer is an amorphous but extremely thick layer which surrounds everywhere the lens, and therefore this is called the capsule of the lens. Deep to it, epithelial cell layer comes. These resemble to squamous epithelial cells, as well as the majority of the substance of the lens consists of fibers of different diameters with very unique shape, compactly packed together, and these are the fibers of the lens. Don't forget that so in the future when you say fiber, you should always be more precise. You've learned muscle fibers, nerve fibers, for example, collagen fiber, connective tissue, any other type of fibers. So these fibers have got nothing to do with these previously mentioned ones, because these are just processes of these epithelial cells. So these are epithelial cell elongations, these lens fibers together. The compactness of the fibers varies according to the peripheral part of the lens, which therefore should be called the cortex of the lens, and inside the nucleus fields of the lens, having the same structure, almost the same structure of these fibers. You can see this from the illustration of Kirstich. The complete lens is shown here with the capsule anteriorly and capsule on the back side. Epithelium is revealed when capsule is partially removed. These epithelial cells are enlarged here, and these epithelial cells are the ones which have got processes, and these elongated processes equal to the lens fibers, to the fibers of the lens. These fibers are different in the cortex and the medulla. In the cortex, in both places, somehow hexagonal, the cross-section of them is, but more coarse, the lentil fibers, lens fibers are in the cortex, and finer in the nucleus, as well as the connection between them, because that is the use of these processes, protrusions, as well as the corresponding invaginations on the opposite side, to keep the lens fibers together, to be able to move together, not independently shifted, related to each other, but together they should move. So here some bulgings and depressions corresponding to that keep them together, the fibers together, and in the nucleus these are just very tiny mini ridges fitting into grooves on the opposite side of the other lentil fiber. Within the lens, there is a group of nuclei extending from the equator of the lens towards the core of the lens, and this is called the nuclear zone, in which the same cells seen on the anterior surface of the lens, the same cells are visible, and these cells are responsible for the continuous production of new generation of the cells during the life. In newborn, the number of the fibers is something 1,400, which increases in adult to up to 2,000 different concentric layers of these fibers. The fibers are uniquely fused with each other, and this line of fusion, if you view from anterior, corresponds to an upside up Y-like system of sutures, which are called the radii of the lens, the radia of the lens, and the anterior surface, but they so trickily curve from back to anterior or anterior to the back. They unite on the posterior surface of the lens in another system of sutures, turned by 60 degrees, so this one corresponds to an upside down Y line of fusions. So posteriorly, these are the ones which unite in this differential. When people get adult, I think everyone heard about the senile presbyopia. It means that they do not have long enough arms to be able to read books or anything. So it means that they are unable to accommodate to close objects. It means that the lens with age becomes rigid, and therefore it does not collapse when close accommodation is needed. So the reason why in flattened situation the lens becomes rigid, perhaps because most of the time of our life we spend with no close accommodation but distant accommodation. When sleeping, for example, or just being in parasympathetic situation after having a good meal or anything, the lens becomes flat. So most of the time it stays flat, therefore becomes fixed in this flat situation. The posterior component of the refracting media is the vitreous body. This vitreous body, as the name suggests, almost completely consists of water bound to proteoglycan molecules and everything. So mostly water makes it up. It is practically structureless thing. When you put a vitreous body onto a filter paper, after 2 minutes, almost nothing is visible. So the 2% of its component out of the water is hardly recognizable. Some people can somehow recognize whirly arrangement of the proteoglycan the microfibrils within, but in general it has no structure. But still, because it is a type of loose connective tissue, or connective tissue, must consist of two necessary components, the cells and intercellular substance, and as everywhere else, the intercellular substance consists of fibrous and amorphous materials. The fibrous materials, collagen microfibrils, tropocollagen here is again a specific tropocollagen, the vitrosin, and collagen fibrils. So microfibrils and fibrils are recognizable. Here you can see the structures of the microfibrils and fibrils. The amorphous material, almost completely of water it is made, plus the hyaluronic acid molecules bound to the microfibrils. The cellular components belong to two classes, but not important to deal with them. Nothing is visible on the histological slide. One resembles to a star, therefore it is a stellate, and the other is a round with secretory granules responsible for production of the amorphous material. The most important thing to be emphasized here, that this pressure, the turgor of this corpus vitreous body is the only thing which keeps the retina stretched towards the inner surface of tunica vasculosa. So if anything goes wrong, it loses its water contact. Then the retina has got the tendency of being separated. Later we are going to talk about the layer of separation, but this is called the detachment of the retina or retinal ablation. Looking through the cornea with a specific tool, you can see the line at which the structure changes from normal to abnormal appearance. So this is the part where the retina has lost its connection with the rest of the retina. Other things, very briefly, the eye chambers, but previously almost completely we mentioned them. Into the posterior eye chamber, the ciliary processes produce the aqueous humor, and from here, through the pupillary margin of the iris, between the posterior surface of iris and anterior of the lens, the aqueous humor flows and reaches the anterior eye chamber, when finally gets removed from the eye through these different spaces, the fontana spaces, and the spongy part of the sclera, spongious sclera, into the Schleb's canal. The Schleb's canal is freely recognizable on our histological slides, and it serves as a landmark for orientation. From Schleb's canal, aqueous veins are the ones which transmit the aqueous humor into the episcleral veins, as well as small volume can resolve it through the tunica vasculosa, the choroidal veins as well. When there is compression of the tissue due to the dilation of the pupil for a long time, these spaces, the sclera, the spongy part of the sclera gets compressed, and therefore the aqueous humor cannot leave the eye, and this is the reason when the eye pressure gets increased, and of course it is not good for the very delicate layer of the retina. This disease is called the glaucoma, and the therapy for that would be the only temporal therapy would be to making the pupil more narrow, therefore releasing from pressure the spongy part of the sclera, spongious sclerae. Next big component of the visual organ after finishing the eyeball, we finished it, optic nerve and optic tract would come now. First of all, I think I should mention, not first time but not last time, that this nerve is not a nerve. I should prove this to you. Again, Professor Kirstich's illustration, cross-section of the nerve, longitudinally revealed part of the nerve by removing the superficial components, and an enlarged piece of the nerve. The square shows where the piece was taken from. What you can read at histological pictures also with two different magnifications. In higher magnification, easier to recognize layers, the coverages of the optic nerve itself. On the schematic illustration, the outermost coverage, indicated by yellow in the enlarged picture, is a dense collagenous connective tissue. If you recall the coverages of the peripheral nerve, the outermost coverage would be the epineurium, which is not dense collagenous, but this is a dense collagenous connective tissue. Deep to this dense collagenous connective tissue comes a layer attached to the inner surface of it, and this layer has got tiny, mini, delicate trabeculous processes connecting this layer with a third layer on top of the optic nerve. This appearance, I think, quite well resembles to the subarachnoid space you became familiar with the brain with. And this is really subarachnoid space. According to that, the coverages from outer inward are the same as for the brain. The outermost is the continuation of dura mater, then comes the arachnoid with the subarachnoid space, and the last coverage is the pia mater itself. The pia mater is separated from the nerve itself by basement lamina, and within the nerve someone can see cross-sections of mostly myelin. 98% of fibers are myelinated fibers, so myelinated fibers of different diameter you can see, so that would fit for the nerve very nicely, but the cell which produces this myelin is not a Schwann cell, as you can recognize. As we said before, in earlier lectures, the Schwann cell is a monogamic cell, but this cell has got myelin sheath formed around several adjacent nerve fibers. Therefore, this should be a real oligodendrocyte. Just to consider the same things on the histological picture, dura mater is well recognizable here. Then comes arachnoid, of course artificially separated from the inner surface of dura mater. Subarachnoid space, it has lost its content. You remember the content of it. The CSF is the one which fills up subarachnoid space. So that was keeping the arachnoid attached to the inner aspect of the dura mater. And then comes pia mater, again artificially leaving the surface of the optic nerve itself. it has a great importance that the subarachnoid space following the optic nerve reaches the posterior end of the eyeball. The importance of this is that in case of the increased intracranial pressure, this intracranial pressure extends around the optic nerve, and because it is increased pressure, therefore is able to compress vessels within the nerve itself. The vessels are the central retinal artery and vein, and of course by increasing the intracranial pressure around the nerve, first the vein is compressed. If the vein is compressed, then there is an edema within the point where the optic nerve lives, and that is freely visible by looking through the cornea into the eye by a specific ophthalmoscope. Oligodendrocyte was also indicated here. And then comes accessory organs, the first of them, the eyelids and conjunctiva. The eyelids mostly consist of a framework, which is a dense collagenous connective tissue layer, a shell-like layer according to the shape of the eyeball, covering on its anterior surface. There is a superior tarsal and inferior tarsal plate. Don't mix with the tarsal bone, of course. This is also called tarsus, superior tarsus and inferior tarsus. Adjacent structures to the adductus of the orbit you are going to learn in regional anatomy, but also you can expect these structures by knowing the holes, and this is a hole, or this used to be a hole, holes or notches on the addutus of the orbit. According to that, through infraorbital, foramen infraorbital structures come through the supraorbital notch, the supraorbital vessels, of course, so these are additional things. Don't forget that at the medial edge of the addutus of the orbit, just behind of it, there is a groove for lacrimal sac. Therefore, this is the place where lacrimal sac is. The superior and inferior tarsal plates are united both medially and laterally with each other, and these are the medial and lateral palpebral ligaments. These tarsal plates, I don't know which one here, the superior tarsal plate is shown. These tarsal plates are covered by muscles anteriorly, and of course by skin more anteriorly, with all the normal characteristics of the skin. The muscle itself is the one which surrounds the eye, surrounds the orbit itself, the addutus of the orbit. This is orbicularis oculi muscle, and that part of it is called the palpebral part of orbicularis oculi. Someone can recognize fantastic, huge, enlarged holocrine sebaceous glands at the posterior part of the tarsal plate, or extending into the tarsal plate itself. These are sebaceous glands but modified, and therefore we call them tarsal glands, and these are independent from hair follicles. But there are normal holocrine sebaceous glands opening into the hair follicle. These are the glands of Zeiss, and there are the normal sweat glands belonging to the skin, and those are the Mollerians glands of the mole, also embedded in the connective tissue, loose connective tissue of most of the palpebra. The next component of accessory organs, lacrimal apparatus, is to be discussed briefly. Everyone remembers the phospholacrimal gland at the junction between the lateral and superior wall of the orbit, fairly anteriorly, just behind the addutus. And here the gland is located, of course. And the gland is separated into two different parts by the tendon, which is belonging to the muscle, which lifts the superior eyelid, and that is called levator palpebrae superioris muscle, and the tendon of it separates outer part, orbital part, from the inner palpebral part of the gland. So gland is located here, but the resorption of the lacrima is across the eye on the opposite side. Here you can see histological picture, and I think it is obvious for you that all the characteristics except the slightly wider lumen, all the characteristics of the acini correspond to that of a typical serous gland. So this one is a purely serous gland, the lacrimal gland. Question how to separate it, or how to make the differential diagnosis from the parotid, which is also purely serous, and the exocrine pancreas. And these are the things you should always look for. If you see infiltration of lymphocytes in between the acini, that is correct, absolute characteristics for the lacrimal gland. That is histology. The composition of the tear film on the anterior surface of the eye is an interesting thing. At least it was quite new for me. The lipid is not a new thing on the anterior, so that is the film itself, and that corresponds to the anterior surface of the film, and that is to the back surface of the film. So there is a very thin layer of lipid covering the eye, and that is produced by the meibomian glands. Those are the glands independent from hair follicles. So the meibomian glands produce the lipid film, and then the most of the lacrima consists of the product of the gland itself, that is a serous fluid, and that keeps the eye wet together with the epithelium of the eye, of course. So the epithelium is to be kept wet. And the strange thing to me was that a very thin layer of mucin on the posterior part of the film itself. And this should be produced by somewhere, but the lacrimal gland is purely serous. So what are the cells producing the mucin? And this is the new, fairly new recognition. Here is a pattern, here is a map of the position of separate goblet cells embedded in the conjunctiva. Epithelium of the conjunctiva is the same of the cornea, so stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium, but still it contains some goblet cell scattered inside. The next thing, how the lacrima moves and how it is drained from the orbit itself. So first, the orbicularis oris muscle, by contraction of its different parts, is responsible to move the lacrima from one edge to the other edge of the orbit. So first, the peripheral muscle fibers contract, pressing everything towards the center. This is called the orbital part of the muscle. And the next to contract is the palpebral part, which from lateral to medial presses the film. And finally, the medialmost part of the orbicularis oculi muscle, the lacrimal part, should contract. And because this one partly originates from the wall of the lacrimal sac, therefore it pulls the wall by increasing therefore the lumen of the lacrimal sac, in which the pressure gets reduced. So the negative pressure practically sucks the lacrima into the lacrimal sac. So two different very tiny canaliculi. These are called the lacrimal canaliculi. There are one above the superior and one below the inferior lacrimal canaliculi, starting at small flashy enlargements on the rim of the eyelid itself, and these are called the caruncles, the superior and inferior caruncles, lacrimal caruncles with spots. The canaliculi start, and they together enter the lacrimal sac, which continues into the nasolacrimal duct. And everyone knows the opening of the duct opens into the inferior nasal meatus, into which the lacrima is drained finally. Everyone knows that the first sign of being about to cry is to make this sneezing, because more and more lacrima reaches. The second thing is when you increase blinking of the eye, pressing the lacrima towards the side. And the third is when the lacrima starts to flow down on the anterior surface of the face. If there is occlusion of the cistern, specific diagnosis is to be made, and this is made by ophthalmologists by very delicate, fine drains, needles inserted into different parts, and then the location of the occlusion can be determined. The development of the eye should be summarized briefly. At the 4th week, the eye primordium is very nicely recognizable from the lateral view. Further development results in the complete development, which almost finishes at the 13th week, and this is the final beautiful lookalike of a completely developed eye. Something to be emphasized now. All the happenings extend from 3rd to 9th week, which equals to the period of organogenesis. So at this period, if some things, the listed things, act, then they increase the probability of the development of disorders of the eye. Amongst them, I think we should emphasize again this beautiful virus, the rubella, measles virus, which is the most dangerous of all. But amongst them, the bacterium of the syphilis also can produce severe disorders. Other viruses as well, drugs and toxins, and either higher or lower level of vitamin A also is responsible for the disorders. There's different components of the eye have a different origin from different germ disc, embryonic germ disc. Ectoderm and mesoderm, of course the endoderm should not take part in the development, so these two germ layers, ectoderm with all the sub-portions of the ectoderm becomes important in the formation, and mesoderm around the eyeball. The early development, you can see the bandings of the neural tube, the cranial part, so these are the primary brain vesicles. This is telencephalic brain vesicle. After that, the diencephalic comes. The telencephalon protrudes out, and the primordium of the eye first appears on the lateral ventral aspect of the diencephalic brain vesicle as an outgrowing small bowl-like structure. This is 22nd day, so the anterior neuropore is still kept open, and there is a big depression here on the rostral part of the neural tube, which is called the sulcus encephalic groove, and here you can see the protrusion of the primordium of the eye. With further growth, it further moves to lateral direction when it gets contacted with a thickened part of the surface ectoderm, and that is part of the placode ectoderm that was called in the first semester the lens placode. By interaction of the two cell masses, further growth happens. First, the eye cup is the one, eye bowl grows out, and when the eye bowl gets pressed by the inward moving lens placode, then the double layered bowl is produced. There is an outer and the inner layer, and then we call it optic cup and optic stoke. The stoke being this connection part of it, and the optic cup is a double layered bowl-like structure. Further development is seen here when there is only a narrow space between the outer wall and the inner wall of the optic cup, and as well as you can see how arteries deepening into the optic stoke, which later becomes the optic nerve, of course, so deepening into reach the center of the eye, and these are called the hyaloid vessels, the hyaloid artery and vein. Deeper the lens placode sank at this time, and soon it loses its connection with the surface ectoderm, and getting trapped into the bigger and bigger developing eyeball. Important thing to mention now that the inner layers of the retina and the outer layer of the retina develop from two different parts of this eyeball, eye cap. Only the first layer of it develops from the outer, and the rest of the remaining 9 layers develop from inner layer of the vesicle. And in between them, for a while, there is a space. And this space only disappears when the remaining 9 layers are pressed towards the first, and this is the reason why if separation, ablation of the retina sometimes happens, then this is the space which reopens again, and therefore the first layer gets separated from the remaining 9 layers by the ablated retina. Further development, you can see the lens, which really lost its connection with the surface ectoderm, has almost lost its cavity because primordial lens fibers are to be formed from the posterior surface of the lens placule epithelium. Here the same thing you can see with the vitreous body starting to develop after the lens. At the initial portion, the lens is separated from the anterior eye chamber by a continuous layer of loose connective tissue, but of course this one has got neural crest origin, and this is called the iridopupillary membrane. Finally, iridopupillary membrane should disappear, and the connection between the anterior eye chamber and the lens becomes complete. Here you can see the outermost layer of the retina. Outer side of it, there is a connective tissue layer which gives rise to the developing choroidea, but this is in reality the continuation of pia mater of the brain, and outside the sclera starts to develop as condensed mesenchyme, dense collagenous connective tissue. It should be turned into, and this is the continuation of the dura mater of the brain itself. Surrounding mesenchyme gives rise to the extraocular eye muscles, the muscles of the eye. Here is a summary of different components of the eye. What do they develop from? From ectoderm, from the neuroectoderm, the eye cup, with retina, sphincter pupillae and dilator or dilatator pupillae muscle together, as well as from the stop, optic nerve derives. Mesenchyme of neural crest origin, so neural crest is the next component of the ectoderm here, but turns into mesenchyme, as you remember for tooth development, for example. We mentioned that mesenchyme migrates to the first, second pharyngeal arches from the neural crest. The same applies to that kind of mesenchyme, which gives rise to all the listed structures. Here, the placule ectoderm gives rise to the lens, and the surface ectoderm to the anterior epithelium of the cornea, epithelium of the conjunctiva, which are continuous to each other, as well as to the lacrimal gland. Mesoderm is responsible for formation of the vessels of the retina, as well as the muscles around the eye, as well as the orbital fascia, the linings, inner linings of the orbit itself. There are some malformations very quickly mentioned here. When the iridopupillary membrane remains for extent, then this is called the persistent iridopupillary membrane. If the choroidal fissure at which the hyaloid arteries were protruding into the eye remains open, then this one results in coloboma of the iris, as well as there could be some herniations through the sclera itself, herniations of the tunica vasculosa and the retina itself, therefore it is called retinocele, and related to the mutation of the SHH gene, which is responsible for medialization, lateralization of all the structures. This cyclopia could be resulted in or produced, which consists of proboscis, which is a process at the middle of the frontal region, holoprosencephalia, it means there is no separation of the telencephalic vesicles, as well as the cyclopia itself refers to a single eye somewhere here in the midline. So it is the cyclos. Rare developmental disorders are listed here, but to be known for ophthalmology course. Just summarizing the different factors involved in the development. First, it should be emphasized that the key gene is the PAX6 in the development, in all the development of the eye. The anterior part of the neural ridges produce this express high volume of the PAX6 gene, which really induces the development of the eye primordium. The precaudal plate in turn, so just in front, rostral to this neural tube, precaudal plate expresses the SHH, and due to this, the level of the PAX6 gets reduced and PAX2 gets increased, and this results in lateralization. So that is the reason why continuously laterally the eye primordium grows. The eye cup, when the cup is formed, here you can see, itself produces PAX6 in high level, and due to that, the surrounding surface ectoderm on top of it, this is the one which becomes the lens placode. This one expresses FGFS factors, which further act later to the neural layers to the outer part of the eye vesicle or the eye ball, which expresses CHX10 gene, which helps them to turn into the neural part of the retina, so the inner 9 layers of the retina. The PAX6, due to the increased level of the PAX6, the surrounding mesenchyme produces TGF-beta factor, which increases the level of production of MITF factor here, which makes the outer wall of the eyeball to turn into the pigment layer of the retina. Several others, including the T gene, the PAX6, several other genes are involved in the development of the optic vesicle itself. Lens placode is due to the increased amount of these factors, either being responsible for elongation of the epithelial cells or increasing the number of epithelial cells, the cell proliferation. That's how the lens fibers are formed. Thank you for your attention.